It's April 13, 2020, and you have 2 days left to file your taxes. But that can wait, because it's time for the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Paperback Warrior Podcast, episode 39. We're a vintage fiction podcast discussing paperbacks and authors from the 20th century in the action-adventure, crime, spy, and western genres. We have a wildly popular blog at paperbackwarrior.com where we post daily reviews of old books we read. You can keep up with us by following us on Facebook or Twitter, where we have pages set up under the Paperback Warrior brand name. Let me throw it over to my co-host Tom to talk about today's exciting episode.
Before we begin our festivities, Eric, I need to run something by the listeners. To date, all the content we provide at Paperback Warrior has been free to listeners and readers. As of today's episode, none of our content exists behind a paywall, nor do we take advertising. We work on the same model as NPR and PBS, where if you like what we do and you want to support the show, you can donate to us. And we have a PayPal account set up for that. Recently, we've had some out-of-pocket expenses for audio equipment, splitters and other stuff to keep this Rube Goldberg machine we call a recording studio up and running. If you like what we do and you have the ability to donate, please go to the Paperback Warrior homepage, go to the desktop version, not the mobile version, and click on the PayPal donate button in the upper right-hand corner to throw a couple bucks in the tip jar. Both Eric and I have wives and kids that we are constantly lying to about how much we spend to keep this ship afloat. So if you can donate, you might just save our marriages. Thanks.
You just publicly confessed our little...
That's true. In fact, both of our wives actually listen, so this is a dangerous game. Anyway, so on today's show, we're going to be doing a feature on the work of Wade Miller and reviewing a Wade Miller novel called Kitten with a Whip. And you're going to be reviewing a book called My Gun is Quick by Mickey Spillane. And if there's time, we're going to discuss the quality difference between 1940s crime fiction and the stuff from the 1950s. You ready to launch?
Yes, go for it.
All right. All right, again, our feature today is on Wade Miller. Wade Miller is one of the most successful crime fiction novelists of the 1950s and beyond. Wade Miller was actually two dudes who wrote together as collaborators. Their names were Robert Wade and Bill Miller. Both were born in 1920, and they met when they were both 12 years old in music class at Woodrow Wilson Junior High School in San Diego, California. They became fast friends and began writing together as teenagers, drafting radio scripts and plays and sketches. They went to San Diego State College together, and they both majored in journalism, and they joined the Air Force together when World War II rolled around. After the war, they wrote their first collaborative novel under the Wade Miller name. It was called Deadly Weapon, and it was a private eye story set in San Diego, published in 1946. In 1947, they published a book called Guilty Bystander, starring a private eye named Max Thursday, which launched a successful series for them. Thursday is a drunk with a bad temper living in a crappy hotel. He has to pull himself together when his ex-wife visits him to report that their son has been kidnapped, and Thursday needs to recover the boy. It sounds like a great book. I have not read it. This was followed by 5 additional Max Thursday books through 1951. Wade and Miller also wrote a bunch of standalone novels through the 1950s, some of which we've actually reviewed at Paperback Warrior, most of which were published by Fawcett Gold Medal, and several will remain in print today. They also wrote books under the name Whit Masterson, including Badge of Evil in 1956, which became the basis for the 1959 movie Touch of Evil, directed by Orson Welles. Together, these guys wrote 30 novels together and about a dozen short stories. They also used the pseudonym Dale Wilmer for a novel called Deadfall that's supposed to be pretty good. So the 1950s end, and Bill Miller has a heart attack in 1961, and he dies at age 41. Robert Wade kept writing novels under his own name as well as using the Whit Masterson pseudonym. So that's the basic bio I have, and I want to credit Brian Ritt's excellent reference book, Paperback Confidential, for the info. His article on Wade Miller was really helpful, and it was reprinted in the excellent Thrilling Detective website. I want to go through some of Wade Miller's books so you, the listener, can decide where to start. And I want to begin with the ones that you and I, Eric, have read ourselves that we reviewed at the Paperback Warrior website.
Yes, I did read The Killer by Wade Miller. It came out in 1951. It's about a big game hunter and a safari guide who gets hired by an American to hunt and kill a bank robber who killed the client's son. The hunter becomes involved with the bank robber's estranged wife. It's a great manhunt novel that stretches from the Georgia swamps to Chicago and then out to Yellowstone National Park. It was a decent novel, but really could have been a lot better, I thought.
I read and reviewed a book called A Cry in the Night, written in 1955 under the Whit Masterson name, and I love this book. It's about a teenage girl who gets kidnapped on Lover's Lane by a maniac, and the police work through the night to recover her before it's too late. I loved it. You should read it. I just learned that there's a sequel of sorts where the same cops need to solve another crime in a Whit Masterson novel called A Hammer in His Hand from 1960. I also read and reviewed their 1959 paperback called Kitten with a Whip that was made into a movie starring Anne Margaret. And I'm going to review that later in the episode here. I have a hunch that I haven't read the best stuff that Wade Miller had to offer. So I turned to a friend of mine who's an expert in the Wade Miller oeuvre. His name is Howard Andrew Jones, and he's a contemporary author of heroic fantasy novels with his most recent trilogy starting with the novel For the Killing of Kings. If those kind of books appeal to you, you should check out his website at howardandrewjones.com. I had Howard write a couple paragraphs as a primer for Wade Miller, which eventually evolved into an article on his blog, and he gave me some great leads for books that you and I need to read, Eric. Howard has read every single book written by Wade and Miller. Regarding the Max Thursday books, he says that each Max Thursday book is a strong novel, and every one of them is different from the others, both in tone and subject matter. They usually fall on the gritty side of things and are intricately plotted, so don't go reading online discussions because they tend to spoil the whodunit. Unlike other hard-boiled novels from the same era, the Thursday books are best read in order, he tells me, because Thursday starts out in the series fighting severe alcoholism, and his relationships with secondary characters evolve and change in the subsequent books. As for the standalone, my friend Howard's favorite is Devil May Care, about a brutal but likable mercenary known as Big O heading down to Mexico for some easy cash. He's a simple and honorable guy, and it's great 1950s adventure thriller stuff with some wonderful character arcs and subtle writing. Howard's other standalone favorite is the thriller Stolen Woman, about a piano player south of the border blackmailed into delivering a dangerous package. Sadly, neither Devil May Care nor Stolen Woman have ever been reprinted, so you have to order the old paperbacks if you want to read them. He also recommends a book called Nightmare Cruise, a nautical thriller set in the Sargasso Sea with a coolly capable female yacht captain, and Girl from Midnight, featuring a veterinarian who gets embroiled in a murder. I have that one on my shelf. I'm going to check that out. Then there's Sinner Take All and Devil on Two Sticks. Both beat slightly different paths down the trail of bad men attempting to leave their profession. One is an assassin, and the other is a highly placed mob figure. Now, Hard Case Crime reprinted a Wade Miller book called Branded Woman that I have, but I also haven't read it yet. Howard says it's decent, but not as good as the ones that he liked that I mentioned earlier. Howard has a buddy in publishing who encouraged Hard Case Crime to reprint Devil May Care, but the Hard Case Crime dudes decided to go with Branded Woman based on the incorrect belief that it's a superior novel, and Howard assures me that it's not. He gave me a list of next-tier honorable mention novels, but I think you got plenty to work with here already. So I want to thank Howard for the consultation, and you should check out his website at howardandrewjones.com. Before we leave the world of Wade Miller, I'm just going to launch right into my review of Kitten with a Whip before I turn it back to you. Is that cool?
I would never want to cease your momentum.
All right, good. Permission granted. Kitten with a Whip is Wade Miller's 1959 novel that was packaged as a Fawcett Gold Medal paperback designed to titillate male readers. The quote on the cover was, "She had a child's mind in a lush woman's body, and she reached for evil with both hands."
Man, I like that.
And again, the novel's called Kitten with a Whip, so it's got to be the hottest S&M crime book
right.
of all times, right?
Yeah.
No, not really. It's actually just a very decent suspense novel, very much in the gold medal tradition. Our protagonist is a paunchy 33-year-old San Diego suburbanite named David Patten. As the book opens, he's like giddy with excitement at the possibilities of the adventures that await him because his wife and daughter are out of town on a trip. You know how that works, where you get excited when you're going to have the house to yourself for a weekend, then you spend the entire weekend just reading books, and pacing around and eating TV dinners. His dream of adventure actually takes focus when he wakes up in the middle of the night to find a hot 17-year-old chick wearing a nightgown prowling inside his house.
Lordy mercy.
We quickly learn that her name is Jody, and she's a runaway from the local girls' reformatory who broke into David's place looking for a change of clothes and somewhere to sleep. So instead of turning this young, sexy fugitive into the authorities, David decides to show some hospitality. Now, the central tension of the book's opening act is David playing chicken with his desire to have sex with his troubled teen, but his knowledge that this is probably a bad idea. So the interpersonal dynamic between these two characters, the suburban schlub and this manipulative sex kitten, provides the central tension of the novel. And their relationship evolves over the course of the weekend, and David ties his life into knots to avoid his neighbors and family from finding out about this uninvited guest. Lots of psychological manipulation happening in the book, which makes for some compelling suspense. David has to thread the needle on this volatile and delicate situation to keep the pages turning, despite minimal action in the story. There's not a whole lot that happens, but then there's this explosively violent conclusion. The authors get to play with two central ideas. One is fear of women, and two is fear of adolescence. And if you remember, the juvenile delinquent subgenre was really popular back then.
Yes.
You know, Rebel Without a Cause and all that. And there's a whole subsection, Facebook groups dedicated to juvenile delinquent literature. The premise is that neither group, teenagers nor women, are entirely rational, and that one's use of logic and reason is basically just an inadequate response to their impulsiveness. These aren't themes that would play well at all in today's world, but they make a really satisfying glimpse into the mindset of 1950s America in what I thought was a very compelling novel. As many may know, Kitten with a Whip was adapted into a very cheesy 1964 film starring John Forsythe and Anne Margaret. However, a more fun way to enjoy the film might actually be enjoying the comedic Mystery Science Theater 3000 edit, which, as of the last time I checked, was available for free on YouTube. Anyway, read the book first. Dark House has reprinted it, and they double packaged it with Miller's 1966 novel, Kiss Her Goodbye. And I recommend it, Kitten with a Whip by Wade Miller. It's a decent book. It's not going to change your life, but it's really a lot of fun, and you're really going to keep the pages turning because it's compelling. Because how did this middle-aged dude's going to get away with all this? Anyway, so you got a review of a Mickey Spillane novel, right? Yeah,
I think it's our first Mickey Spillane talk on the show.
Lay it on us.
Yeah, let's do it. So hardboard crime novels reached a pinnacle of popularity in the late 1940s. Many scholars and fans point to Mickey Spillane as the catalyst for this pop culture phenomenon. His debut novel, I, the Jury, was published in 1947 and became an instant runaway bestseller. The book introduced the world to the iconic Mike Hammer, a fictional private investigator that pursued bad guys, mostly in New York City. Hammer is known for his physical rough-and-tumble, unorthodox style, gained from his U.S. Army experience in World War II's Pacific Theater. Hammer's closest friend is Pat Chambers, the captain of homicide in the NYPD. Hammer also has a flirtatious affair with his secretary. Her name's Velda. While I struggled with I, the Jury, and found it really flat, I wanted to attempt another Mike Hammer novel to see if it produced a different experience. Tom, I chose the second series installment, My Gun is Quick, and it was published in 1950. It's an important year that we might even get into a little later today if we have time. The novel begins with Mike Hammer having coffee at a neighborhood diner. An attractive yet homely woman takes a seat beside Hammer and asks if he can buy her a cup of coffee. Hammer, never turning away female companionship, obliges despite warnings from the diner's owner. After a brief conversation, Hammer learns that the unnamed woman, who Hammer later referred to as Red, was probably in a prostitution ring and was just in a really bad place in her life. Hammer feels a great deal of compassion for the woman, and he offers her some money to set her life back on track. Happily, she thanks Hammer, and the two go their separate ways. The next morning, Hammer learns that the woman was struck and killed by a drunk driver. Hoping to help identify the woman, Hammer meets with Pat to examine the body. But after finding some bruises and markings on the woman, Hammer suspects that she was actually murdered. So despite Pat's advice, Hammer starts investigating the woman's history and what led to her death after their chance meeting. The investigation takes Hammer into New York's call girl racket and a millionaire named Baron Groton. After Hammer learns about the girl's connection to one of Baron Groten's staff members, the wealthy businessman actually hires Hammer to investigate the murder further. Along the way, Hammer falls in love with a reformed call girl named Lola, and that was part of the narrative's most effective scenes, in my opinion. It was really touching to see Hammer and Lola strike up this relationship. Listeners, the first thing you need to know is that My Gun is Quick is a far superior novel to Eye of the Jury. I will receive a lot of flack for saying this, and I'm sure Spillane and Mike Hammer fans will stoically disagree. I'm just waiting for the hate emails to come in, Tom, because I think they're going to come. But personally, I just found that Hammer is way more dynamic in this novel. With Eye of the Jury, Mike Hammer is just this deadpan dude. He's this gruff, he's this loudmouth detective that just comes across as really abrasive and crude to me. Further, in the series debut, Hammer really doesn't solve anything. Instead, the clues are all just served to him like on typewritten notes. Spillane's writing in My Gun is Quick provides so much texture to this character. Hammer is drawn to this unnamed woman. His client's voice is speaking to him from the grave. She's pleading for him to find her identity and provide retribution for her death. The idea that Hammer may have caused her death by putting her back on the streets is just really clever writing. It's a brilliant, multifaceted narrative that has Hammer's pursuit of the killer as his own personal attempt at forgiveness. My Gun is Quick is one of the best novels I've read of any genre. Mickey Spillane's masterful prose is saturated in gritty realism, emotional stress, and this, I don't know what to call it, like this thick-laced impending sense of doom throughout the book. If you read nothing else, read this novel. Tom, we recently had a discussion off mic about mid-century crime fiction and our favorite eras. I thought it would be fun to recreate that for the listeners in this short segment.
All right, so to be clear on your position here, you read the first Mickey Spillane book from the 1940s and thought it was just okay.
Right.
And then you read this one you just reviewed from 1950 and thought it was great. Am I characterizing this correctly?
Yes.
Okay, good. And I think there's a drastic quality difference between 1940s crime fiction and 1950s and beyond crime fiction. As soon as 1950 began, things began to get grittier and better, in my opinion. And I can track this to a couple factors. One, paperback original novels really came into the mass market existence in 1950 or so. Before that, hardcover books were expensive, and they were targeted to a different, wealthier, and more educated class of people. With few exceptions, mysteries before 1950s were more literary, and in my mind, less fun, and more densely plotted. There were paperback books published during the 1940s, but for the most part, they were reprinting successful hardcover books. So we got 1950... comes along, the paperback original novels start getting printed, and they were cheap at 25 cents. And this was popular entertainment for the masses, often men returning who had come back from World War II, and they wanted something fun and exciting to read. This also coincides, Eric, with the death of pulp magazines, which filled that need for pedestrian, lowbrow reading for the working stiff back in the 30s and 40s. So we have this glut of pulp authors, guys like John D. MacDonald, for example, who were awesome storytellers who had developed their kind of muscles for writing to create the ability to write fast. The pulp market disappears overnight, and there's this new market for paperback original novels that opens up in 1950. And these guys had a leg up, these pulp guys, and they were able to hit the ground running, writing books like, Ace Doubles, Fawcett Gold Medals, Lion Books. As such, it makes sense that the 1950s would present a more muscular, violent, and twisty set of novels than you would have found in the 1940s. The pulp authors from the 1940s really couldn't have broken into books in the 1940s in traditional publishing because they were carrying around this disreputable stigma of being pulp writers. Now, the 1950s allowed this class, if you think of it that way, who've graduated into books, allowed them to break through that glass ceiling and actually begin writing novels in the form of paperback originals.
I think it's also possible that Mickey Spillane might have had that effect on the market himself as his work matured and just became, I guess, popular in the 1950s.
I'd say that's without question. There were times where Mike Hammer books, I believe, occupied 8 of the 10 spots on the New York Times bestseller list. Mickey Spillane changed the game for violence and grit in crime fiction, and it became this arms race to keep up with his lurid plots with salacious details and extreme violence. This rising tide created by Mickey Spillane lifted all the boats in the 1950s, and it was Spillane leading the charge and really creating a market for these books that we're still discussing today on the podcast and our website.
Yeah, I mean, based on my experience of Spillane's transition from the 40s into the 50s, I think I would definitely agree with that. And I'd speculate that myself, I tend to gravitate towards the 1950s stuff. I just want that little bit of extra edge that I think wasn't as prevalent in the 1940s.
Agreed. And I'm not even saying that there weren't great things that came out before 1950s. There's plenty of great stuff that had lots of balls between 1930s and 1940s. I would say the Continental Op stories of Dashiell Hammett were super hard-boiled and really set the stage for a lot of the best stuff of the 1950s. From a noir fiction perspective, two of my favorite books ever that were copied relentlessly in the 1950s were The Postman Always Rings Twice from 1934 and Double Indemnity, both by James M. Cain. Double Indemnity started out as a magazine serial in 1936 and was later compiled into a hit novel in 1943. And if you haven't read those two novels, you should do so. They hold up well today. I, however, think that my favorite year, when I look at the copyright on a book, was 1959. By that point, they had begun introducing a little more graphic sex into the books. Not totally graphic like we saw in the 70s and 80s, but a little more edgy sex, and the violence was kind of dialed up a notch. There's something about 1959 that produced so many of my favorite novels. 1960 was also a fine year, but there's just something sweet about 1959.
I have to look this up, but I want to say John D. MacDonald's The End of the Night came out in 1959, and I could see a stark difference with that particular novel, in particular because of the overall violence, the sex, I think there was some rape in that book.
I mean, I think the paperbacks kind of got out of their adolescence probably in 1959 and became like fully matured, and the authors knew exactly what the public wanted, and it was something a little more dark, and I really dig that.
So let's freestyle for about 5 minutes because we got some extra time. I want to ask you, we've been on some shopping trips before, and I've noticed that when it comes to Mickey Spillane, you tend to skip over his stuff, and you've actually told me that you're not collecting Spillane anymore.
I've tried reading Mickey Spillane novels, and I've not read the one, My Gun Is Quick, so I'm going to leave you at your word that it's great, and I just really can't get into them. I know Stephen Mertz, a famous author, is a huge fan and advocate of Mickey Spillane, and knew him. Max Allan Collins is basically controlling the Mickey Spillane name now as far as stuff, and so these are guys I really respect who have nice things to say about Mickey Spillane, but every time I read a Mickey Spillane novel, I just can't get into it. So I'm glad you found one that's great, and I want to try them. He's got other series also beyond the Mike Hammer series. Right. One's called Tiger Man. I believe it's Mann, and I think that might be like a spy series, which looks kind of interesting.
Yes.
And then he's got this whole series of westerns that based on outlines and rough drafts that he wrote that Max Allan Collins is finishing and sprucing up and publishing even to this very day.
Right.
Some of those may be great. Again, I'm not saying Mickey Spillane wasn't awesome. I'm just saying that I haven't been hitting the right notes when it comes to finding Mickey Spillane.
Okay. We'll save the rest of this for our Mickey Spillane feature coming soon, I guess.
Yeah, we should definitely do something. I mean, the guy is a legend.
You've got a stack of books there.
Yeah, and one thing I want to hype, and it's probably a little early to be hyping this because it doesn't come out till May, but you can pre-order it now on Amazon. There's an author by the name of Frederick Lorenz, Lorenz, and he was a writer for the Lion Books line, and he wrote two books, one A Rage at Sea and one called A Party Every Night, that are being re-released as a double with a pretty cool cover from Starkhouse. And so the A Rage at Sea looks like the one I'm going to read first, and it's going to be high on my list because it's a trapped on an island, like dudes, like guys who are trapped on an island together after a shipwreck, and they need to survive and kind of go against each other. So sort of a very dark Gilligan's Island or a non-science fiction-y version of Lost. I like the setup. I've read several novels about shipwrecks where people are trapped on an island together and need to kind of square off against each other. And I really like that setup for a book. And so A Rage at Sea looks like a fantastic one. And A Party Every Night looks more like a kind of dark sleaze novel, but I need to get deeper into it. I've only looked at the Lion Books version. And the author, again, is Frederick Lorenz, and this is a double coming out from Starkhouse. And they've always been very good to this podcast. You should check them out.
Awesome. Anything else?
That's all I got. How are we doing? Do we have time to kill?
Yeah, you got a couple more minutes.
All right, so I got a couple other books in the mail. I found a blog, I wish I could remember the name of it, that recommended a bunch of crime novels. One is Squeeze Play by James McKimmey. This guy said it's one of the best noir novels he's ever read. I got to check that out. I finally buckled down and purchased Hell Can Wait by Harry Whittington.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's one of the most highly regarded Harry Whittington books that has never been reprinted.
What did that cost you?
I found it for like $9,
Wow.
like delivered. So I had to jump at it. It's in pretty good condition. I'm looking forward to it. I wish Harry Whittington books would get a second or third life, and finally somebody would just start reprinting the greatest hits. There's a Facebook group called, I think it's called Vintage Paperback Covers, that's really focused on cover art. But the guy who runs it actually is really insightful. And so he featured a posting and a little bio on an author named William Pearson, Pearson, and I found a book by him called The Beautiful Frame. It's a pocket books, and so it looks kind of good, like a basic crime novel. And I found another book, which I can't remember much about. There's a story behind this one called Root of Evil by James Cross. And it's got a sexy cover. It's a Crest book, and we know when we see Crest books that that Crest was an imprint of Fawcett Gold Medal. And some of the Fawcett Crest books were reprints, but some of the ones that just say Crest book are basically just extras that Fawcett Gold Medal never got to, that they put out in their Crest label. It's essentially no difference. So
Nice.
That's what I've been purchasing lately. I've been doing a lot of eBay purchases. I haven't taken my show on the road. My employer is not excited about us traveling too much while this health issue is happening in America.
Yep.
And hopefully that'll blow over soon, and I can get on the road and tell you guys about some more trips.
Yeah, we've got a travel freeze at work too.
Yeah, so that's kind of where we're at. So I believe, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
That's it. We're done.
All right, great. Well, that's this episode of Paperback Warrior. Join us at paperbackwarrior.com, and we'll see you next Monday. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you. Bye.